Hello?
Hey Mari,
Hi!
how's it going?
Good, how about you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well myself.
Good, good.
Alright, so let me invite you to a study. Oh,
Okay.
and for my Twitch chat, I'm not gonna be like responding because this is a lesson, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna put that out there. But there is an L command.
There is an L command, awesome.
L command.
Just for me. Cool.
Yep.
Okay.
Alrighty. So today I want to talk about this wall of pawns that you mentioned having trouble with.
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna talk about, what to do when your opponent just keeps pushing pawns at you
Okay.
and why that's not generally a good strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wanted to do a little bit of review. Think back to our lesson last week on weak pawns.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember, I like to say pawns don't move backwards and emphasize that when a pawn moves, it leaves behind squares.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing to look out for is when your opponent is pushing a lot of pawns, be aware of what they might be leaving behind.
Mm-hmm.
So, you remember, this move e4 leaves behind some weaknesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So white might play a move like this and try to gain space, kick your pieces out, and it's easy to react as if you're getting pushed back and just think, oh no, they're coming at me, and then move your pieces back.
Right.
But do you remember what to do in this instance or
I,
cases like it?
I think there was a way to get out of danger, but also like put pressure on new weaknesses.
Exactly.
So going here attacks this piece twice.
Well, that hangs the knight, unfortunately.
Don't want to do that. Um,
But yeah, you have the right idea.
this way.
Exactly, yep. So then we're taking advantage of the fact that white has left behind the d3 pawn and
Mm-hmm.
created that weakness. And, let's say white defends, we can hop into that hole left behind. So, this is something we've looked at before, but it's one of the keys to dealing with an opponent who just keeps pushing pawns. It's not sustainable because they're leaving behind weaknesses. And so you have to not be intimidated by their pawn advances and think about what they're neglecting.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to show you quickly some openings where a black at first has a very small center, allows white to grab a lot of space, and then breaks down that center. So this is the Grunfeld defense. Maybe you've seen or heard of it. But this is an opening where you see black is not directly challenging the center.
Mm-hmm.
And finally we go d5, but at this point, white has a big pawn center, right? And it looks like white is dominating here. White can just keep pushing. But the key to dealing with a big center like this is to break it down. You have to make pawn breaks against it.
Okay.
So moves like c5. And this is the main move here in the Grunfeld. And you'll notice now black is actually putting a lot of pressure on that center, and it's not at all clear what's going on. White doesn't just have a big center for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this is about equal. So you see, this is an established strategy in a lot of modern openings. The same with the 4 pawns attack in the King's Indian defense. So if you look at this, this is a classic example of when an opponent gets a wall of pawns, right, with the 4 pawns attack. And this looks very, very scary. It looks like you're just going to get run over by those 4 pawns in a row.
Mm-hmm.
But keep in mind that if your opponent is spending the opening moving pawns, that means they're not spending a lot of time developing pieces, right?
Yeah.
So then that creates vulnerabilities. And again, you do have to work to break down the pawn structure. Let's say, black is playing more passive moves like this. Then black is going to get run over, right? So you do have to strike back. You can't just allow your opponent to keep pushing pawns forever. So here the main move is c5. Again, we strike and start to break up that pawn center. White can advance, but now we break it down further with e6. So you always have to look out for those key pawn breaks like c5 and e6. And don't just let the pawn sit there. And now the main line continues like this. And black now puts pressure on the e-pawn. And then knight g4, and you see how white's pawns are also a liability. Right? White hasn't developed as much, white isn't cast, and those pawns are under attack. So again, this is also about equal, but you see how it's far from black just getting run over with that pawn center.
Yeah.
So the pawn breaks are key. Okay, so let's look at an example of breaking down the pawn chain. This is actually a variation from a game I played. I had a lot of space. I was playing white here. I had a lot of space, and I didn't play the move c5. But let's imagine white had played c5 here.
Okay.
Do you think this is a good move?
So it was here.
Yeah, the pawn has moved from c4 to c5. So, do you think that's good?
It seems to just be like just solidifying this closed kind of center.
Well, it looks that way. But again, we have a way to break it down. Sometimes a big pawn center is an illusion. Now look at white's development. White has only one piece developed, so there's not a lot to help out with the defense of the pawns, if that makes sense.
I'm guessing probably like this.
Yes, that is the right move. b6. Anything else just loses, or positionally. Let's say we just develop the knight. Now white starts pushing you backwards, right? And this is the kind of situation where you just feel your position slipping away because white now does have an overwhelming space advantage.
Yeah.
But instead, you can play b6 and break down that pawn chain. So once again, we've identified a key pawn break. And look at white's options. If white takes here, then the d4 pawn is actually a pretty clear weakness. And now, what pawn break do you think black should try for next?
Maybe this one?
I would be careful about going f6.
Okay.
It's actually something I wanted to mention because I saw in a couple of your games that you played f6, and you want to be very, very cautious with that move due to the light scores around your king.
Okay.
But this is a common idea in the French defense and some lines of the Caro-Kann. But I would say c5. So for instance, maybe white plays, I don't know, just develops a piece or something. c5 is, or maybe here, and then we can play for c5.
Okay.
And then, now you see actually black is taking over the center. This is just an all-around pleasant position. But you have to make sure to break it down.
Right.
Okay, or if we go b6, and let's say white ignores it, or defends the c5 pawn but allows this exchange, then look what's happened to white's pawn center. Again, a liability, right? We have those weak doubled isolated pawns on the c file. Now white has some compensation, but yeah, not that massive pawn center that we thought we were dealing with.
Yeah.
So always look for those pawn breaks against that big center. Okay. So now let's look at some examples of when a player just pushes too many pawns, and pay very close attention to what is being neglected. So, by the way, this is something that happens probably more often when you're playing black, yeah? That, white just starts out with a big center, and so we have the Alekine's defense, and this is an opening where white generally does get to push a lot of pawns, but let's say white goes overboard with it. So let's say white plays b4 here and creates this massive wall of pawn. So it's black to play. How can we break this down?
My instinct is to play this.
So let's say if we play c5, we don't actually have enough for the pawn, but I would say at this point we don't need to. It's a interesting try though. It's definitely in the spirit of what we've talked about.
Or can push this one as well.
So let's say we go d5. White will push past with c5. And you're walking a fine line between, white's overextended or you're getting pushed back. Here I'd say you're getting pushed back. But there's no reason to allow any of these moves.
Should I just take?
Yeah, you just take, and this is actually similar to something I saw in one of your games. So yes, the idea is just take, and a lot of times if you open up this line, you can actually just take away their castling rights. Yeah, I mentioned this because I saw this specific idea in one of your games, and now look at white's fragmented pawn structure. Right? A big center is a lot less intimidating when white's got this pawn that's essentially isolated. And in fact, knight c6 forks the pawns.
See, that's something that I do, but I don't think about it in terms of breaking up the pawn structure. I just think about that in terms of like getting the tempo advantage and taking away their ability to castle.
Yeah, well, that's of course good too. Depriving the opponent of castling rights is generally very good, but I mean, again, think back to our lesson on weak pawns, right? If you can separate the pawns and leave white with all those pawn weaknesses, then going into an endgame, trading off the queens, getting into an endgame will be even more powerful, because then white's going to have all these to deal with, and here you're just outright winning a pawn. So again, it's about the fact that white's neglecting development. White's pieces are all in the back rank and uncoordinated. So if you can get past that wall of pawns, then you can see that white has a lot of issues, right? There's nothing protecting the queen, for instance, except this king. Okay, another example of when the opponent pushes too many pawns. And this is an example of something that I've faced a lot in my own games, because I've played the Pirts for much of my life. Right? The Pirts is a modern opening where black at first gets a very small center, and And the idea with these openings is that you kind of let the opponent overextend. You let them get that massive pawn center, and then you break it down. You attack oftentimes from the flank with moves like c5, as we've looked at.
Okay.
Right? And this is called the Austrian attack. White gets this big pawn center. So this is fine for white. But let's say white gets greedy and keeps pushing, and we have that wall of pawns again. So it looks intimidating, but we can break it down with c5 or e5. e5 is actually an interesting alternative here, and you can get away with this, for instance, here. But c5 is a very similar idea. But break it down. You can come in from the side, and notice white doesn't have much to support d4. Again, white has neglected development and castling in order to get this big center. And the g4 pawn is now a liability because it stops white from playing moves like knight f3, because the pawn would hang. So let's say white keeps going with e5 and tries to push you back. Sometimes it feels like you're going backwards here, but actually you can trade, and now here you're winning a pawn. So you've done the thing where you open up the d file, trade off queens, and now we grab the g4 pawn. Or if white is stubborn, here, now what do you think we can do?
Wait.
How do you think we can exploit the weaknesses?
Hey Ed, thanks for tuning in.
Oh, it's Ed. Hello.
This is definitely a tactic or a position that I should be familiar with, but I'm not sure how to pick between all
Not
different
necessarily. I'm usually asking you to identify positional concepts more than straight up tactics.
Yeah, sorry. The patterns, I guess. Yeah, not tactics. Because I've had these kind of positions a lot, but I'm never sure, like, what is the best thing to do. So, okay, let me walk through my thought process. I can make a counter attack, but that's probably not great because I've got too much that this pawn can eat.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we take here, yeah, this is actually, this is interesting, but we have to take this one. I mean, we have something better.
Yeah.
So notice the open lines that have been left behind.
Okay.
And I want to emphasize this idea that space is only space if you can control it, right? If you push your pawns up really far, then that space you have can actually turn into infiltration points for your opponents.
I mean, we can just take this pawn, right?
Well, it's protected twice.
Oh, yeah.
By the bishop and queen. There are several good moves here. One really stands out to me because it's so thematic, but...
I'm trying to evaluate if this is a good move.
Good. It's good that you're looking.
Because we're down a pawn at this point, right? And we kind of want to take back eventually.
Let's see. No, we're not down a pawn. We've got 7 and they've got 7.
Well, I can't capture this pawn, and I don't want to let it be taken, so I've got to move the knight somewhere. So I'm thinking one of these two squares. I'm not sure that...
Very nice. Those are the best moves. Yeah, either one is good. My personal preference is knight d5, and of course, if white takes, then we get on this diagonal. And see what I mean about space becoming weakness if it's not protected well? Right,
yeah.
because white's pawns are so far up, this diagonal is wide open. The king is wide open. This d4 pawn is falling, and everything is just crumbling.
Okay, yeah.
If we go to d7, we're going after the e5 pawn, and of course threatening to take on d4, then on e5. Both moves are very good, but, I like that we are doing something active with our knight. Right? White is trying to push us back by threatening, but we can basically turn the tables and put pressure on white.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's another way you can just deal with this pawn advance, is to see what's been left behind, like this diagonal, this pawn, etc.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so now let us look at an example of a master game where the opponent, white gets overextended.
A 27-year-old game. This game is 27 years old.
Oh, have you seen it before?
No, I'm just reading the the tags.
Oh, the tags! Oh, I didn't even realize I had tags.
It's older than you. That's fine. Most chess games are.
I'm young, I guess. What could I say? So we have another Alekine's defense, and the Alekine tends to invite this type of play, right? It's just provoking white to push pawns forward.
So that would explain why it looks like a bad opening to me, because I don't know how to play against it.
So I mean, it's not. I don't want to criticize the Alekine too much. Like, it's not the most popular choice at the top level, but it can be good if you know how to play it. It's not my personal preference either. You have to know what you're doing, again. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, white gets this wall of pawns, and there's that fine line between space and being overextended. So, here, again, white has this, and it greatly restricts black's development. So that's something that you're going to have to deal with. Alright, this knight doesn't have a lot of freedom, but also notice white has zero development. Zero. And these pawns are way up here. Also, the king is exposed. Right, all these squares are just open around the king. So black continues to develop. And again, this bishop's on a nice diagonal. We have pressure on the c4 and d4 pawn. Okay, and now a very thematic move here, bishop to g4. So why do you think black bothered to move the bishop twice?
That's a good question.
Because normally you don't do that, right? You don't move the same piece twice in the opening, unless there's a very good reason. And black does have a very good reason.
Yeah. Well, for pinning the knight.
Yes.
To
and why do you think we care so much about pinning that knight?
So that we can break down the pawn wall.
Which pawn?
This one? No.
I would say the d4 pawn.
This one.
So this is a common technique to fight for the d4 pawn or square. You'll play bishop g4 to pin or capture a knight on f3.
Yeah.
And that indirectly adds more pressure to d4. So,
but there's still going to be two attackers on it, or two defenders.
Yes, but let's say that white, let's say white just wastes a move. Then this is quite interesting because, if the queen takes, the d4 pawn falls. So white is forced to take back with the g pawn, and now this diagonal is wide open. Now, maybe we can't take advantage immediately, but this is weakening, and I would say it's worthwhile. So this is a threat, and white has to respond. Bishop e2. Now black takes anyway, and the important thing to note here is just because we can't immediately win the d4 pawn doesn't mean it's not worth putting pressure on it. Because pressure restricts the opponent's pieces. Right now, white's queen and bishop are tied down to the defense. And so, once again, you see how space becomes liability. Right? That pawn is far advanced, and yes, it does cut off some of black's squares, but it's something that white has to perpetually defend.
I see.
So now black adds even more pressure to the d4 pawn. And white is starting to get in trouble. So white plays d5. And this looks scary, right? The wall of pawns is coming. We're being pushed back. Or are we? So this is actually a key moment in the game. Sometimes you have to be very aware that your opponent's threats are not actually threats, or at least you might have a bigger, badder threat of your own. Right? You can't let yourself be pushed back repeatedly. So yeah, I'll give you a moment to see if you can find the move.
We have more firepower. Can't we just take? Because of take.
So there's other things to consider. If we take, white's not going to recapture immediately, but can instead play bishop g4. And this is messy. This is messy. Something like this. And the bishop, this bishop is really strong.
Okay.
I would say white's holding on to the big pawn center pretty well. So we've got to be aggressive here. We've got to really fight back instead of allowing ourselves to get pushed backwards. This is a tricky move, so no worries if you don't find it, but I just want you to take a moment and assess the situation and
That's a challenge.
Get comfortable with the notion. Well, I want you to get comfortable with situations like this where it looks like you're getting pushed back and your opponent has a bunch of threats, but it might be an illusion.
I mean, what are they really threatening? If I move my knight, they don't get much out of it, but a knight here is pretty scary, because if the queen ever leaves, then I can fork here.
The only problem with that is if the white plays a3. So let's say white can just kick you out.
Yeah, I can't station there.
So do we have to move the knight?
Well, wait. No. Because, well, I mean, it's kind of pinned to the queen, but I'm not seeing that being a huge threat because it's defended 3 times.
So we have an extremely rude move here, which is bishop to b4. Yeah. Now, first off, we are putting more pressure on d5. Now, the obvious question is, why can't white just take?
Yeah.
So we take back, and now notice the double threat on the queen and the rook.
Wait, how did that happen?
Well, so the queen moved.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a discovered attack on the queen.
Oh, and there's no pawn here anymore.
The undefended rook. And now you see the drawback of having your pawn so advanced. Because this diagonal is wide open, and of course white hasn't had the time to castle.
Okay.
So those open lines can quickly turn against you.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely need to look out for those.
Of course, again, bishop b4 is not an easy one to see.
I mean, I thought of it as a move, but I didn't think it was that good.
Oh, you thought of bishop b4?
Because, like, I didn't think that trading would be that much, and it kind of has the same problem of being kicked back.
But again, we're putting indirect pressure on d5, right?
Yeah.
It's just like this bishop g4 move. Attack the d4 pawn by attacking the piece that's defending it. And here we're attacking d5 by attacking the piece that's... This is very, very common, using the bishop pin to undermine the center.
Yeah.
So, you know, white wants to trade off a key attacker of d5. And now we're breaking down the center, and then the queen gets to infiltrate in the space left behind. And you see, suddenly this is a huge weakness because there's all that empty space behind the pawns, and black is coming in.
For our pieces to land.
Yeah, and now white has to play moves like king e2.
Okay.
What else is white gonna do? White can't legally castle kingside. And, you know, let's say white tries to get away with, like, queen e2, then we can bring the knight in with tempo. The queen's tied down to defending this. The knight's pinned. Everything is just falling apart. So now white doesn't get to castle. Of course, black brings the king to safety. And then we have a nasty case of white's king being uncastled in the center of the board. And we'd like to eventually rip open the center and take advantage of that. B5 is a nice little move, because if the queen takes, then we get to further break down the center with tempo. And now notice we've blown open the D file, leading to white's king. And this is something you want to do when your opponent is uncastled and their king is in the middle. Just rip open lines to open up the center, open up files leading to the king, and go for the attack. And of course we're putting pressure on the weak pawn. And everything is just falling apart here. It's only a few more moves. And white resigns. I look at white's position.
Yeah.
We just got behind all those advanced pawns, right? This used to be so powerful, and now it's just empty space for the queen and the rook to invade.
So you gotta find the weak point and invade behind enemy lines.
Exactly. Yes, you want to get behind it. And the key to this game, it's important to note that the opponent is overextended when they've neglected their development and when they're too far advanced to protect themselves, right? There are times when this kind of pawn storm will work if you yourself are not adequately defended, right? If the opponent can back up the pawns with pieces, then this absolutely is something to be feared. So this wall of pawn strategy only works when you have enough pieces behind it. Does that make sense? Alright, so now that we've talked about breaking down these walls, let's try to apply these concepts to your games. So, I found some more of your games which have this wall of pawns, including the one that you've shown me. Okay, so you were playing white here, and immediately your opponent just goes for this wall of pawns. Okay, so the first question is, what is black leaving behind? What sort of weaknesses? Yes, I would say black is, first of all, not developing at all. Zero development here. Black has light squared weaknesses. Now, black does have a light squared bishop to cover some of them, but the f7 square especially is weak. This diagonal is open. That could be an issue later. And black is making this f8 bishop very bad. So again, pay attention to the weaknesses that your opponent is creating by advancing so many pawns. And now, this is the game I was referencing earlier, where you can just trade queens and take away the castling rights. So I would have just gone ahead and done that.
Did I not?
Then you get to castle with tempo.
Oh,
no.
I've done that so many times.
Unfortunately, you never played queen takes d8.
Okay.
So here, then this is just a nice position for you. I mean, just move back and
Yeah.
this is a pretty easy game,
Pleasant.
but yeah, and here as well. So you'll see this a lot when you manage to open a file. Okay. It's another key moment. So Black is uncastled right now, and should probably address that at some point. But instead, Black is wasting a lot of time pushing pawns. Okay, so now this is fascinating. The engine actually suggests knight d4.
What?
Now this looks kind of absurd, and the idea is this is a piece sacrifice, but after this, Black has an awful position, and we get compensation. Now that's not a very human move. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't see that in a game, and it's tricky, but this does illustrate, you know, your Black is so restricted, so behind in development that we can actually give up pieces to, you know, take advantage of these open lines, right? Because now Black is in a tactically vulnerable situation with the queen and king lined up on an open file. And where's Black gonna castle? If Black castles queenside, then we can just rip it open. Black can't castle kingside because there's so many pieces in the way, and of course the king being in the center is a liability. So that's the kind of thing you can do, although I don't think many of us would play knight d4 here. It's a tricky move to find. You can also play rook e1 and, you know, set up these tricks for later. Okay, so now here's a key moment. Black is clearly coming after you on the king's side, and it looks like this is dangerous, right? Black's probably gonna play h4 next. In fact, that is what Black does. So one of the biggest threats you have to watch out for when the opponent's rapidly advancing pawns is getting your own pieces trapped.
Yeah.
And that's what happened here with Black played h4.
Yeah.
And you got your bishop trap. So you have to make sure your pieces have squares, because that kind of unsound pawn advance can quickly be disastrous for you if you don't have adequate squares for your pieces. So you need to break it down. And the best way to do that is h4. Stop the advance, break it down. Now, of course, you can take on g5 next and isolate the e5 pawn. If Black pushes past, then you can further break it down with f4. And you see how we're going to rip open that file and everything's falling apart.
Okay.
Or if Black does this, then we can get this diagonal, we can get the e4 square. Everything is nice here. But yeah, trapped pieces are the biggest danger, and that's what cost you this game, just the fact that the bishop got trapped.
Yeah.
Okay.
It seems obvious in retrospect, like h5, h4, you just want to play h4 yourself, usually.
Yeah, so once you're aware of that, this idea that, okay, wall of pawns means I need to make sure my pieces have escape squares, you'll be a lot less likely to miss it. Okay, so this game, this was another wall of pawns game. So White just starts pushing a bunch of pawns. And, you know, this is all fine so far, but White just keeps going and going. And so here, it's much better to go knight a5 and preserve the dark squared bishop, because you notice that White's got their pawns on light squares, right? And we want to be able to take advantage of the weakness of those dark squares. So we don't want to trade off our own dark squared bishop. This bishop is going to be super annoying. I mean, let's say white castle's kingside, and then this bishop's pinning the f7 pawn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and here, yeah, like I pointed out, f6 is generally a weakening move.
Yeah.
So instead, just go knight f6, and white's wasted some time moving the knight to g5. That's not a sustainable square for the knight, because after knight f6, say white castles, you can always kick it out if you want to with h6 and just make the knight go back.
Mm-hmm.
But be very, very selective. I would almost never play the move f6 just because it creates so many weaknesses around the king.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened in this game was that you started being the one to push the pawn. Right? You went g5, and then that creates weaknesses around your own king. So you kind of went the wall of pawn strategy yourself. That was really the deciding moment here. So if you just play knight f6, then eventually you can break down the center with c6.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Let's say I do that. Do I recapture with?
Well, I wouldn't say immediately.
Oh, okay.
I would definitely castle first, just get out of danger. And at some point, you can also kick the knight back. You can play against the e5, and you can also put a knight on c5. That's a square where that's an outpost. Again, pay attention to the weakness of the dark squares, right? White's got a light squared bishop and pawns on light squares.
Mm-hmm.
So those are good holes for the knight.
Cool. Yeah, I see this as a 10-minute game.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know this is. I tried to put in some slower games. Let me see the tags. This is also 10 minutes. This one's a longer one if you want to look at this.
No, it's fine. It's just, it will be easier once I kind of have these concepts when I'm thinking of moves.
Yay.
Because 10 minutes isn't enough for me to like calculate the theory.
Yeah, well, some of the stuff, so like the principles of like, don't push f6, that's the kind of stuff that you can implement first.
Yeah.
Just, I guess it's easier said than done, but try to break the habit of playing those moves on instinct.
Okay.
Okay, so this game is something a little bit different. And again, as I was talking about the difference between having space and being overextended, this is an example of your opponent actually being able to get away with the wall of pawns because they were ahead in development.
Wait, quick question. You said don't play like f6. Is that the same for white? Like c?
Yeah. No, f3.
No, f3. Yeah, because the king's over here. Okay.
Yeah, it's all about just not exposing the king.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the thing about bishop d3 here is it also makes it susceptible to being hit by, c5, c4. This is a fairly subtle point, but you'd like to allow, black to, or you'd like to let this sit here until black moves the bishop, right? I think maybe you've talked about this before. But it'd be nice if black moves, and then you can make the bishop move again, win a tempo. But, if you have the bishop on d3, then black can play c4 next. So, and then knight a4. So these moves are kind of... I mean, this is a one-move threat, and I see how you want to kick the bishop off the diagonal, but you should be focusing on completing your development first.
Okay.
Because that's a general principle. Just finish development, get castled before you move the same piece twice. And the knight doesn't have a good long-term role on a4. So again, focus on bringing new pieces into the game. And the reason I show this game is that now your opponent is able to start pushing pawns against you. And here, your opponent is perfectly justified to do so. Again, the reason is that you're behind in development. Your opponent this time is the one who's castled, and you're not.
Right.
So I want you to be able to recognize when your opponent is pushing pawns and playing nonsense while neglecting their development, versus where it's you who's neglected the development and you're actually worse. Does that distinction make sense to you?
Yeah, I think I'm getting a better idea of like learning how to balance between like development and like improving my position, or like when to castle, like castling straight away or castling later and things like that.
Yeah, again, I maybe I'm beating a dead horse, I don't know, but the trouble with the move knight a4 is it doesn't really improve your position. We don't want that knight on a4 long term. So, I mean, I would... Yeah, improving your pieces, I guess moving the same piece twice is sometimes justified if you're improving the piece. If it's a one-time opportunity to make a piece much better. But yeah, black, maybe black shouldn't have done this so soon, but again, black is able to open up the center because black is the one castled instead of you.
Yeah,
and
then it becomes troublesome.
Yeah, and then things kind of start to crumble here. So the lesson here really is make sure you stay on top of your development. And I would err on the side of caution. You know, once you gain more experience, then obviously you'll be able to better judge when it's really worth moving the same piece twice. Maybe there's a nice positional gain that you wouldn't otherwise have. But for now, I would really try to stick to the principle of developing a new piece each turn and trying to castle within the first 10 or so moves of the game, so you don't get into situations like this. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, wait, why are you sorry?
The person arrived early. I told them not to come until 6. But yeah, anyway.
So okay.
They're gonna have to wait.
Alright. So, yeah, knight a4 was I think that was the game deciding, not really the game deciding mistake, but the one that created the weaknesses that led to your opponent being able to have a big center. So, if you were to go back and do this again, like, instead of bishop e5, I'd play knight f3. Yeah, b5 is going to come at some point, but you should be trying to break down those pawns eventually. So, black can get away with this, but you need to fight back. So I would castle. Keep your king safe first, and now, how might you go about breaking down those queenside pawns? Oh, sorry.
You mean like these pawns?
No, the ones on the queen side.
Oh, wait, these ones?
Yeah.
Why do I want to break those down? Is the first question.
Oh, well, first off, your opponent has a lot of space, right? You're restricted, but also remember space can turn into weakness, and ideally you'll want to turn them into weak pawns. So let's hypothetically that you could exchange. Let's say you manage to play a4 and somehow trade off these pawns, right? That's one potential way to break it down. Then your opponent would have a weak pawn on b5, and sometimes you can even win those pawns.
Yep.
So yeah, that's why you want to break down the pawns, because eventually, if you just let your opponent have this kind of formation, they're going to push you further and further back. You've got to do something about it.
Okay. I'm not sure if that affects that side directly, but but I can attack this pawn. Because if I can get onto this diagonal, then I can make use of the space.
So yeah, I think e4 is a... e4 would be really good, except that actually b4 comes. Yeah, positionally speaking, e4 is a great idea.
Okay.
It's just that, unfortunately, it doesn't quite work out tactically. But yeah, that's a good pawn break to look at. It's definitely... Let's say, you play a3 and black wastes a turn. Then we can absolutely play e4, and that's nice.
I see.
Because we're hitting the d5 pawn. Yeah, something you can do is try to isolate the pawns. Like, if black's not paying attention, right? Oh, not here, but... I don't know, I'm just trying to waste a move for black to illustrate the point, which is that you can maybe isolate your opponent's pawns and then turn those strengths into weaknesses that you can later play against, right? You've got an isolated pawn, now the landscape's changed. And that's something you can go after. Okay. So, yeah, that's that in this game. This is the last example. Alright, this one I think is... Oh, this is from... This is a very, very recent game. I think you played this one yesterday.
Yesterday, okay.
And we've got another wall of pawns. So many of these. I'm amazed how many opponents are seeing on like chess.com that just keep doing this. So... Alright.
Wait, did you go through my matches and actually find these?
Yeah? Is that not what you wanted me to do, or...?
No, I'm surprised because I've played so many games. I don't know how you found them so quickly. But anyway.
Well, I went through and looked for games that illustrate the concept, because I remember you saying, you had these games, but weren't sure which ones exactly.
Well, at least one of us had the patience
I know
to
the
find
struggle.
it. At least one of us had the patience to find them.
I know the struggle, because there are plenty of times I feel like I'm missing something specific, but I can't quite pinpoint which games it's happening in if I want to show somebody. Okay, by the way, what do you think's wrong with the move knight c6? Just as an aside.
It blocks in this pawn. That's
exactly. Black might want to play c6 or c5 later.
I never know how to take advantage of that, though.
Well, I love when opponents block the c-pawn with the knight.
And that blocks in the bishop.
Okay, this is also a waste of time.
Yeah.
Right? Because then you can and you do play c3 to kick the bishop back. So this is all very, very pleasant for you so far. You've got, London system formation with lots of extra tempi.
Yep.
Alright. Something you can do here, by the way, is to bring the queen over and actually exploit the weaknesses on the king side, because black has neglected development for so long.
Okay.
Alright, you definitely don't want to give up that light squared bishop. Again, this is not so much about the wall of pawns yet, but just some positional stuff that I'm noticing here.
Okay.
You've got all your pawns on dark squares, right?
Yeah.
So you really, really want to keep your light squared bishop, especially because, let's say black castle's on the king's side. Well, then you can set up a really nasty attack with queen h5, or not necessarily now. Well, actually, tactically, there's just this. Not what I meant to do. You're still doing well, though. Okay, and now black plays c5. So black is making a big mistake by neglecting castling. And, these principles go hand in hand, but when the opponent has left their king in the center. Again, you want to bust open the center and go for that attack.
Okay.
So, again, this is a time-sensitive thing. If you give your opponent a couple of moves, they're going to castle. At least they should. But your opponent hasn't done so, and what you want to do is open up lines and start attacking before they have the chance to castle. You want to take away that ability. So, rook a d1 is a reasonable-looking move, getting your rook onto the semi-open file, but we want to do something faster. We want to strike immediately. So, yeah, white to play. How can we break this down? Think carefully about the lessons on breaking down the pawn chain. Or in this case, even a potential pawn chain, because black wants to play c4.
I'm thinking of two main ideas, right? I can attempt to break this down and trade here, but it's defended. Or I can... Well, if they block with the pawn, then I kind of rip this way. But they could also just move the queen away. I don't know.
So, I really like the move e4. And, by the way, this has an added bonus, because you notice your e-pawns are doubled. And the pawn on e5 is doing some amazing things, cutting off those key squares for black. And now you get to undouble your pawns, too. So there's a little bonus. But the main plan is to bust open the center and create a weak pawn on d5. So c4 is... wait, how's that? Yeah, sorry. You played rook a d1.
Oh, okay.
And then black played c4. And this is a mistake because black can't really hold on to that pawn chain very well. You're going to break it down. That's the idea here. Again, I like the move e4 for the same reasons, except now it's even more powerful because you've got your rook lined up with the queen. So let's say you play e4, black castles, you can take here, and look what black has on d5.
A backwards pawn.
Yes, a backwards pawn on a semi-open file, no less, and you get the d4 square for your knight. That's a whole. So, again, that's the purpose of breaking down pawn chains. You get to turn them into weaknesses. So, I do like bishop g5 as well. Especially because if your opponent just plays queen d7, then I would proceed with e4. But your opponent played f6, so this is very bad by the opponent. Because now you get to rip open the king side.
Right.
Bishop h6 is nice as well. Just taking away black's castling rights. So of course, now the question is, how do we exploit this? Now you play e4, which is excellent. You know, better late than never. This is good. You're opening up lines towards the uncastled king. Alright, and now this moment is really a matter of style. So, you got two options here. One, you can move the queen aside and then play against the uncastled king, or use the extra tempo to get your rook on the open file against the queen. Alright, and then you can play against this. You can play against the queen side. The other option, which you did, is just to trade queens and use... I would actually go ahead and take here right away. So this is... Oh, not that. This is kind of subtle, but... You know, maybe the king is better off on f7. You know, if you take here, then rook e1 is more of a threat, because, you know, the king can't hide as easily, but...
I never thought of it that way.
Unfortunately... Well, unfortunately, you blundered in this game, so we're not gonna really go into that.
There's a 50% chance that one of my games is a blunder in it, so...
But yeah, I will say that in this game, you did a pretty good job of breaking down the center. And
Okay.
the opponent, was kind of stubborn here. So, e4. E4 is the key idea here. Right? Breaking down the pawn chain. And that's the idea. Just trade off and make a weakness on d5, right? That's the point. Making weak pawn or strong pawns into weak pawns.
Okay. I'm always afraid to do pawn breaks because it like just ends up messing up my position and I don't know why. So I guess that's why I've been avoiding it, but that means that walls of pawns are, troublesome.
Yeah, so again, remember that they are bad for your opponent if your opponent's been neglecting their development and castling, right? If they just start off the game and make like 6 pawn moves without getting any of their pieces out, their king's still in the middle, that's bad, and you can play by breaking it down, by opening lines to the king, by creating weak pawns, and by infiltrating, getting behind their empty space. But if you're the one who's slow to develop, slow to castle, then your opponent is justified in pushing pawns with the support of their pieces.
I see. That makes a lot of sense.
Any questions about any of this? I know there's a lot of subtlety and nuance involved in this, so...
No, and I'm glad I recorded this because I'm going to have to go watch it again to make sure I understand everything.
Okay, well that is true. Yeah, this is all recorded on your stream
For
as well. I guess you can download it and listen to it later. But the study's here as well if you want to play through these examples.
Okay, cool.
But if you encounter any more Wall of Pawns games, please feel free to send them to me. I want to see how you fare with them.
Sure. I'll try to make you proud.
Yay!
Alright, thanks, Mari.
No, you're very welcome.
Alright, I'm gonna end my stream here in a bit.
Oh, you are? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have to go deal with my basement now.
Oh, so, yeah, you do.
The guy's here.
Alright.
Alright.
Cool. Well, thanks for being an awesome student, and this was fun.
Thanks for being an awesome teacher.
Aw, you're very welcome.
Alright, catch you later.
Alright, I'll see you. Bye.
Bye. Minister of Truth, thanks for the follow. Welcome to the Elephant Squad. That's elephant with 2 L's. Make sure to also check out the Discord. There's the link. Alright, I'm gonna go now. Bye everyone.